So we're switching things up a little bit. The way we were going to sort of talk was sort of earlier stage, sort of mid stage, and then sort of the most developed maturity. And we're actually going to preserve that rubric, but I'm going to fill in for the early stage. So I'm going to be the moderator, but I'm also going to represent smaller team size. So we're at about 20 right now. Next to me here, we have Harshal, head of security at Medallia. And actually, your story is interesting because the company's been around for a long time, but actually a lot of why you're here today is last few years, right? So you would represent sort of a middle stage, but then hyper growth through IPO. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. And then down the end here, we have Niall. Hey, Niall. So Niall is currently the chief security officer at Domo, but also served the same role prior at Workday. And so one thing I like about your background is essentially there's no case where your customer isn't the biggest possible enterprise. So everything about establishing trust at the maximum level is sort of something that you're fluent in and do every day.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Cool. All right. So now that we've got the intros out of the way, I'd love to actually ask about one anecdote that just in your personal life, you feel like maybe if you hadn't had security exposure, you wouldn't find yourself doing it every day. So something that you do every day that you could attribute to being steeped in this topic. So why
don't we go first?
Yeah,
okay.
Go first, please.
So what I would say is every once in a while when I get a call from someone trying to tell me that I owe taxes and the police is on the way and they need some information, I actually respond to those calls. I don't just hang up. I respond because I want to understand how they operate, what they're after. I don't think if I wasn't in security, if I'm not curious about these things, I wouldn't respond to it. But every once in a while I do.
All right, now can you think of one?
I think for the most part, basically, it's almost like the sense of paranoia. Like the more you get involved in security on a day-to-day basis, the more you realize like how easy it is in some way to compromise people, and not because people are stupid, because they're not. It's because everyone's working on so many things every day. You get an email, you get a call, you get a Jira ticket, and you don't have an hour to think about it. You've got milliseconds to think about it. So for me, it's mostly the model whereby you certainly, as you go through security, you get more paranoid and paranoid, both in your business and then on your personal life as well.
I had this question because actually this came up earlier today for me. I was interviewing a candidate, and as part of the interview exercise, we needed to actually grant this person access to a server. So we emailed them a private SSH key. And because that's such a taboo, I noticed that the taboo was so deeply in my body that as soon as I got on with the person, I said, you know what? Obviously, this is a throwaway server. Obviously, this is a throwaway key. But I had to voice it because every time I encountered those taboos, have to react to it. So let's see. Would you mind sharing a bit about team size again, just so we can calibrate on scale? So we're about 20. What's your team at in terms of total size, as well as maybe the technology team and then maybe the security team?
Yeah, so my company has about, I want to say, 1,800 employees across the globe. A lot of that growth has happened recently in the past about 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years. Engineering, we have about 500 engineers. And my team, security team, is about 14 people.
So Domo is about 1,000 people. Engineering platform, I'd say maybe like 450, 500. And then security compliance risk is about 25 people.
A lot of those sizes sound like perhaps a little further along than some members of the audience. So for a moment, I'd like to actually go back to the beginning and talk about that first wave of don't leave home without it practices. I think the title of this talk is Democratizing Security, and part of that means finding a way for everyone to do security. So if you think back to a team of 50 or a team of 20, what would absolutely be in place for you in 2019, 2020, and beyond? For those earliest moments?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, basically, when you look at security, as Oren pointed earlier on, you have to do security because it's the right thing. But also, you've got to think about security is a way of making you money. So in other words, basically, you're building a product and you've raised seed funding and you've got the seed funding. And now you're like, well, before I go for the next round, I need to have customers. And if I don't have customers, at least I have to have POCs. And you'd want to do a POC. and you go to 30 enterprise customers, you get 5 POCs, you're delighted with yourselves, and then suddenly, the three-legged stool steps in, privacy, legal, and compliance, and they say, by the way, who is this company, Acme? They're doing product, they want access to our environment, they want access to our systems, they want access to our code, our customer data. No way, we're not doing it. And the POC dies a death. And I've seen that happen so many times. And oftentimes, basically, you've got 4 people in a room with a dog. They want to do POCs. They don't have the security expertise. They don't want to hire a CSO, obviously, or anybody in security at that point. How do they go about kind of actually doing that? And I think the number one thing to do is really kind of building up the culture. And if I define culture, it's really what will that person do if they were left to their own devices? And then if you insert securities, what would that person do if they were left to their own devices from a security perspective? And building security doesn't need to be expensive. I mean, in most organizations, it's a case of you get that 4 or 5 people, they set up basically a group and they say, let's call it like the Security Council. They build it as part of basically their core functionality. In other words, we want to be a secure environment, or we want to have a secure system across the board. And then as they're going through their daily operations, they can tag security into that. So one example is every company, when they release code, you don't want to just release code higgledy-piggledy. You want to have some sort of a process for releasing code. Same thing as when you want to shut down a server, you want to do change management. If you hire somebody, there's generally some sort of background process. So if you build a culture, just get the mindset right. Let's do security. It's everybody's job. And then you look at basically, what are we currently doing that aligns with security? It's actually very, very easy then to go back to that customer before, or that POC, and say, oh, by the way, here's what we're doing in security. We're an early stage company, and here's the controls we've put in place. And 9 times out of 10, they will look at you and say, well, they don't have all the controls, but they're generally doing the right things. They believe in security, and basically there's a culture of security. So I would shift it from a technical controls perspective, because that's a losing battle. Do you have IPS, a firewall? Do you have this? You'll never have everything at that stage. If you simply go into the meeting with that culture of security, that's number one. And number two is basically you sit down in that POC and you say, instead of just talking about your product, you say, hey guys, I know the way, this is our product. I know we'd have access to your sensitive data. Here's how we're going to handle it from a security perspective. And it means an awful lot. And certainly I've seen the most successful companies that have grown, they're the ones whereby at the very early stage, they've kind of democratized security, and they've been able to, the most important thing after you do it is to be able to articulate it externally. Otherwise, you're not getting any credit for it, and you're not making any money out of security.
So Harshal, if you, let's say you were part of a team, you're at 30, 40, 50 people, and you looked around, and there's something missing that must be present in that first wave.
Yeah.
What are you most shocked at, and what gap are you gonna close immediately?
A lot of times what ends up happening is that people don't take proactive approach towards security because a lot of times they don't understand what it is, right? In my opinion, security should be treated at the same level as a scale issue or performance issue or a quality issue. Engineers are very familiar with all of those other things, so it's just natural behavior for them to take ownership of those things. And security is not always the same case. So I think, at that level, when you're a smaller company, then you just have to fill those gaps, whether it's a knowledge gap or a comfort gap or whatever it is, and treat it at the same level as any other criteria in terms of delivering high quality product.
All right, so I'm going to speak on behalf of a currently very small company. Because we ourselves are a security product, one thing that I think I've enjoyed participating in is actually taking sort of everyone in the company through just basic hygiene. So that means full disk encryption, password managers, the whole deal, and just getting everyone, even if they haven't been part of a security culture before, regardless what role of the company they're in, they understand that if their laptop gets lost at the coffee shop, it's actually probably fine because we took those steps in advance. So just exposing everyone to a little bit of that hygiene culture early, that hopefully is going to lead into the training later and the awareness training later. All right. So we did kind of talk a little bit about this now in one of your earlier responses, but I do want to just go back to the perception of security as a blocker. So we received a question on this, and just the other side of that coin, security as part of how you create trust in a sales process, and it's how you move your business forward. So I'd love to hear just one practice where that has been manifest into like a document or into something concrete, and it could be an attestation. But what's one version of being able to accelerate sales with an investment in trust?
Yes, so I think for the most part, if you've got the culture, you're generally doing the right thing. You've got already a hygiene process in relation to code. For the most part, you're doing 70%, 80% of what you need to do done. Now, the second thing is you need to get credit for it. And the way I've always done that is you think about security is what you do, and trust is how you articulate that externally. So one example is when I started in Domo, and even then, let's even take Workday as an example. Like day one, I ran their security team, and day two, I created basically the trust program basically for Workday. How could we send to the Morgan Stanley, Credit Suisse, Bank of America? Because we had a lot of the really good controls, but every time we came in front of a customer, we fumbled the ball, and we put architects when we should have put in business leaders, and then when we should have put in business leaders, we put in architects, and everybody had the wrong answer. So the way I would always do basically is, sit down, you've got 4 or 5 people in a room, and you say, hey guys, let's spend 2 hours in this, and let's create a trust white paper. Simple thing, that's all you have to do. Trust white paper, how long is it going to be? You don't want it to be 100 pages. No one's going to read 100 pages, maybe 2 pages max. So if you're going to do anything coming out of this room, what I would say is basically a takeout would be create a trust white paper. It could be Acme Trust White Paper. The first paragraph writes itself. At company Acme, we take trust and security very seriously. We have a culture of security. We have a security council made up of our CEO, our CTO, our CFO, or whoever you got. In other words, there's only 3 or 5 people in the company. This is how we manage basically our security environment itself, using industry best practices. We already do change control, let's get credit for it. We do SDLC, let's get credit for it. We already basically do a process with background checks, that's where we do it. And then when to Justin's point, whereby it's, in his case, it's a product security functionality, you're selling your product into basically the customer, and the customer wants a self-service model. They don't want to be picking up the phone and say, oh, by the way, we want to make you changing 6 different things along the way. So you put in a section to say, by using our product, here's how you can manage your authentication, logging in, authorization, what can you do when they're in there, accounting, how do you tie into that? And even at the very start, you can say data privacy is a huge component. We're building a platform so it can be compliant with GDPR requirements. 4 or 5 people in a room, 2 hours, framework it, whiteboard it, you put it up there, then you go through 2nd draft, 3rd draft, 4th draft. 4 days later, you've got a trust white paper. You then take that, every single conversation you have, it's like, here's our company and here's what we do. Here's our trust program, here's our security model. Done. And then as you grow, you start that off whereby it's a CTO or CEO that's presenting it. Then you hire your first salesperson from that end. And then you say, salesperson, here you are. Get comfortable with this trust white paper. You've got to articulate that. And then suddenly you go from 1 salesperson to 10 salespeople to 100 salespeople. In Workday's case, thousands of salespeople. It's the exact same model. It was the same trust white paper I created in Workday on the first week that we used when we went to thousands of salespeople. We simply basically articulated the vision, and then we trained people in across the board. So if you're going to do anything coming out of this, you want to close the POCs, you want to close you're doing it already, put it in trust white paper, 2 pages maximum, put in a couple of images, articulate the team in training, and you'll go from 0, or basically maybe you're going at 40 miles an hour already, that'll take you up to 70 miles an hour, closing those POCs, closing the customers, and even if you're going to close the customers, upselling, because you don't want to be dealing with innocuous public data. You want the really sensitive PII data. So if your security model can handle PII restricted model, then you can upsell vertically from there.
Marshall, any thoughts on what you might one manifestation of using the investments you're already making to get credit for it and benefit from it in the sales process?
Yeah, so I would totally agree with what Niall just mentioned. We actually did the same thing at Medallia as well. So even before I joined, there were a lot of security practices already in place. But the way we communicated externally to our customers, that was not as polished. And that having this package together, whether it's a trust white paper or compliance certificates or whatever it is, but having a single way of communicating externally, that was hugely helpful. And even going beyond that, so we were selling to the largest Fortune 500 companies, and as you know, they would send a ton of questionnaires and things like that. And I think we have a talk about that topic later in the day today. But having a prepared package of pre-filled industry standard questionnaires, handing it over to the salespeople, that's hugely helpful. That removes friction in a lot of the sales process or expansions. And even having the salespeople or sales engineers knowing how to respond to those questionnaires, that's very helpful. It actually enables the salespeople.
All right, so back to the democratizing theme, but then specifically zooming in on the product and engineering organization. An observation that I've made with teams that I've worked with is even though security topics may not be top of mind in every conversation, there are ways to make them fun. There are ways to make them interesting, and so is there one practice that has stood out or has been successful in your present or previous environment? Where sort of getting the product and engineering team engaged in thinking through security topics, one trick basically to make it interesting.
Yeah, so a lot of times we realize that most of the conversations that we meaning the security team, had with our engineers or other product engineering teams was around security issues or secure coding practices or stuff like that, right? So it's very defensive in nature in terms of defensive security. What we did over the past couple of years is we have captured the flag events within the company, and it's open to all engineers. And basically, we invited the engineers to become hackers for that day. So we provided them training, just basic training on how to do certain things, and sent links to videos or tutorials. For that day, the engineers were super, super excited to wear the offensive security cap and try to get into this application that we had built. On that day of CTF, we had about 40% of our engineers actually participate in it, and we had 400 engineers at that time. So that's a lot of manpower that went behind this, or person power, and it was phenomenal because since then we actually saw a significant increase in the engagement that we were getting from the engineers. They were more understanding of why we were asking them to do certain things. We had this empathy that we were building with them. And just giving them visibility into a different aspect of security was hugely helpful.
I would look at this basically, I think security and engineering has a somewhat contentious relationship. In other words, engineering always sees security as kind of slowing them down. And then security from their side, it has a model, well, why should I do that? Well, you should do it just because I said so. I mean, that's been the classical security model. Do it because I said so. HR says you should do it, you should do it. Security says you should do it, you should do it. Horrible model across the board. You're trying to pull people with you rather than them coming with you. So if I think about from an engineering security perspective, there's two things you really want to think about. One is like the how. Sorry, actually, I'll reverse it. First one would be why, and the second one would be how. So first one is why should they care? And the way I think about why they should care basically is very simple, classic examples of basically, if you do X, this is what happens in the wild. One example, like Oren shared earlier on, about basically never putting keys in source code. So, simple example, you sit down with engineering, and I sent out a security newsletter to our company even just last week, and it was like, if we ever have keys in code, what's going to happen is you take the keys in code. Second step, you upload it in GitHub accidentally. Third step, somebody from Russia or from China or Dublin logs in, and generally they scan GitHub, and within 4 minutes, they've got the key, they've got the code, they've logged in, and they're running hundreds of scripts. You send that to all of engineering, they're like, wow, we do something simple as basically put a key in code, accidentally put it up in GitHub, and 4 minutes later, somebody from Dublin in Ireland has stolen all our data. Has that happened before? Well, yeah, second part of the newsletter. AWS, when they look at that, AWS's security incident team have said to me, basically, 85% of their incidents that they deal with, basically, are specifically down to people putting keys in code and accidentally putting those in GitHub. Now from engineering, I'm like, hey, well, that's not Niall, talking crap about keys and code and all the usual FUD stories. Here's a practical example, and here's a timeline. And then and then from basically, then engineering gets it. That's just one simple example. And then the second thing is, what can they do? And the second biggest issue with security is like, you guys should have known that. I thought you knew that already. Or I thought you knew not to put the keys in code. Or I told you not to put the keys in code, but there's no tool to support that. So the second biggest issue is basically is that now that engineering is aware of that itself and they want to fix it itself, helping build the tools, helping build the models to support them itself, and then, frankly, making it fun. As Harshit pointed out, building up a security champions program, doing a red team, blue teaming. In our company, we have basically a model whereby if you find a vulnerability, we'll give you X dollars. If you fix the vulnerability, we'll give you Y dollars itself. And certainly when it comes up to certain events, we have not a lot of people kind of signing in. But I think, if I look at this really, it's really as why, it's the why itself, why it's important, why they should care. And then the second part is how they can fix it. And security should never be coming up with the answer and saying, this is how I want you to fix it. It should be engineering devise it themselves. Because engineering, it's their platform, their environment, their code. They can come up with a solution to fix that issue exponentially better than security.
So my next question, again, back to sort of while we're still in the everyone does security mode, and a security failure happens. So I'd love to hear just some ways to treat those moments as learning opportunities. And actually, I'll share a recent anecdote from our environment. So we have an AWS account that's, of course, isolated from everything else, and it's deliberately the sandbox environment. It's deliberately just for self-training, right? So you go through training modules and you teach yourself how to use things. And we had exactly a key upload, and it was really we caught it instantly, but it was great to see how fast it was. What the behavior of the adversary was, isolated from everything else, and just that real experiential, tangible experience. So it wasn't a shaming moment for the individual involved. It was definitely learning for the team. Any other structures like that you folks have dealt with for almost celebrating the sort of reporting that it necessarily has to happen?
There's a bug. So like someone has a bug in engineering, or it's a feature that just doesn't work as supposed to. You click on the button, it doesn't work. You're not going to basically go to that person, say to that person, what happened? Why did you do that? How did you, why would you ever think about making that mistake? And then going to HR and get them to either fire the person or put basically a note in their file. That's engineering would never do that, or QA and engineering would never do that to each other. Yet security down through the years, that's been their model. It's like, oh, by the way, there's keys in the code and you shipped it in GitHub, or you released this feature with blind SQL injection. That's a terrible model. So I would almost say, basically, if you want to build this kind of proactive model, instead it should be basically engineering, security, engineering, and QA kind of linking together and really looking at it from the point of view of basically, let's just take the example of keys in the code. So what's the issue there? Well, the code is in the key, first of all. Well, if you've got code in the key, what have you got to do? Well, we've got to get a tool like Vault, and we've got to step that one up. We've got to take the legacy keys out of there, and then we've got to build an automated system to fix GitHub itself. Then we've got to do security awareness. So the ones I find that work the best are the way that engineering and QA treat each other in relation to, hey, errors happen, we need to fix it. What are the 3 issues that are at fault? How do we automate that across the board? And security needs to be kind of part of that model instead of coming in like a HR type entity telling you did wrong, raising hackles and ruining relationships. Instead, it should really be the model of basically of, we found an issue, what's the 2 or 3 things we fix, make it a teachable moment for both parties, automate it, and then after that, then you just track it and try to find out, it's going to happen again. It's like if a service goes down once, it's going to go down 100 times over time. But you can kind of track it and find out generally, basically, are you in the right track or not?
Yeah, and we actually teach them. We actually use those events as a teachable moments for us as well, in the sense that if a bug got introduced or if something bad actually happened, then it's not just some engineer's fault or somebody's fault, but it's really a gap on the security team as well. So because that risk materialized in production environment, hypothetically. So then how can we learn to prevent it from happening again in future? So we use the standard retrospectives when an incident happens, and it's RCA that comes out with action items for everyone. But our perspective is, how can we prevent this from happening again as much as possible? So it's definitely using those things as learning moments for everyone involved, not pointing fingers, is the key.
There's a concept, and we had a question on this, that probably doesn't show up in that first wave, but in that second wave of maturity, eventually you're going to want to look at a number of some type, right? So what's the first, if you're sitting down to make your first dashboard, what's the first probably quantifiable aspect that you would want to put in a metric, track on a weekly, monthly, quarterly? What comes to mind as something you would definitely want to quantify?
If there's a vulnerability and it's internal, that's fine. If there's vulnerability, it's external, that's worse sort of thing. So how many vulnerabilities do you have that you can find that can be externally trackable itself, using simple tools like Tenable, Rapid7, using internal tools for source code like analysis. But really, it's the biggest one I always care about is basically what's my external footprint? What are the external vulnerabilities out there? If you can get that right, you're in a pretty good position.
Yeah, and I would say from a non-technical perspective, if you can somehow track, especially if you're in B2B, I'm assuming there would be security requirements set by your customers. So how many gaps do you have as compared to the contracts that you signed with your customers or customer expectations? And it's on your roadmap. What is that delta? You really should be tracking those things. Because those things could become contractual or they are contractual obligations. But if an incident happens, then those things would come under questioning. So you should really keep a close eye on those.
Okay. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.